Across the United States, neighbor conflict is far more common, and far more unsettling, than most people realize. Recent surveys show that 1 in 3 Americans has experienced a serious dispute with a neighbor, ranging from arguments, threats, and property damage to stalking-like behavior. Police departments nationwide report tens of thousands of neighbor-related calls every year, yet over 60% of these incidents end without clear resolution. No arrest. No explanation. Just lingering fear. And beneath these official numbers lies something even more disturbing: the unreported cases, stories of footsteps outside bedroom windows, voices through the walls, shadows on porches, and people who seem to know far too much about the families living next door. Many of these situations never escalate into a crime, never cross the legal threshold, and therefore remain unsolved. But for the people who live through them, the trauma is real and lasting. Tonight, on Voices from the Other Side, we bring you 6 such encounters. 6 true-to-life tales of ordinary Americans who faced extraordinary fear not of strangers, but of the people living just a few feet away. These are the stories of Howard Green, Mike Carver, Greg Turner, Luke Preston, Eli Gardner, and the Night Stalker. 6 neighbors whose actions left psychological scars long after they disappeared. You're listening to Voices from the Other Side, and these are the stories that remain unanswered in the dark. Looking back at 2013, it's glaringly obvious now how desperately Claire and I longed for a fresh start. We were your typical 20-somethings, utterly weary of hopping between one dilapidated apartment and the next. Claire was on the cusp of finishing her nursing degree, her clinical rotations leaving her physically and emotionally spent. I was stuck working the graveyard shift at a printing press, the kind of soul-crushing job that grinds you down gradually, like sandpaper against your very being. Money was perpetually tight, a constant source of stress. So, when we stumbled upon that small, unassuming duplex on Hawthorne Street in Cedar Falls, Illinois, it felt like an outright blessing. 2 modest bedrooms, a single bathroom, a tiny porch adorned with peeling paint, nothing to write home about, but undeniably ours. Cedar Falls was that quintessential Midwestern town where everyone claimed to know everyone else's business. Yet, we quickly discovered that the familiarity was more superficial than genuine. People offered polite waves, but they didn't linger for conversation. The town exuded that characteristic small-town politeness, but it always carried an unspoken undertone, * we keep to ourselves here. * the landlord, a man named Dale with a perpetually dusty baseball cap, made mention of the other occupant of our duplex. Howard Green, he said, adjusting his cap, his gaze momentarily drifting toward the neighboring unit. Widower. Been here for 15 years, give or take. He paused, adding, quiet as a mouse. Never caused me a lick of trouble. Our initial impression seemed to validate Dale's description. Howard was a man who appeared to be in his early 60s, although it was hard to say for sure. He possessed a thin, almost frail frame, gray hair meticulously slicked back, and pale skin that perpetually looked as if it hadn't seen enough sunlight. He seemed to favor the same beige cardigan and brown slacks, wearing them almost daily. When we cautiously introduced ourselves, he offered a polite nod, a stiff, almost strained smile, and promptly returned to meticulously trimming the rose bushes that adorned his side of the porch. As we walked back inside our unit, Claire leaned in close, whispering in my ear, "He seems harmless enough." "I thought so too," I replied, "at least at first. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. During our first week, I received a call from Claire while I was at work. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I think I heard someone in the hallway between the units." Slow, deliberate footsteps, and then, this knocking. 3 distinct raps. It sounded like it was coming from the wall. I tried to reassure her, suggesting it was probably just the old house settling. Every old duplex groans and creaks at night, I reasoned. But then it happened again, always around 11 or midnight, when the rest of the neighborhood was plunged into silence and Claire was alone. One afternoon, attempting to be neighborly, I struck up a conversation with Howard while he was tending to his roses. "You've got a nice garden," I commented. He glanced up, his eyes a pale, watery blue. "Roses don't talk back," he muttered, and then offered a faint, unsettling smile that sent a shiver down my spine. I laughed awkwardly, unsure how to respond to such a bizarre remark. Later that evening, Claire commented, "Did you notice how he never really looks at you? It's like he's staring through you." I dismissed it, attributing it to grief. People grieve in peculiar ways, I reasoned. He'd lost his wife, after all. Maybe he was just profoundly lonely. But as we settled in, the stranger the atmosphere became. Things seemed to move on their own, boots inexplicably shifted on the porch, Claire's umbrella leaning in a spot where she swore she hadn't left it, the porch light unscrewed more than once. Then came the night that irrevocably changed everything. I'd just arrived home after a particularly grueling shift. The rain was coming down in sheets, the streetlights casting hazy, ethereal halos. As I stepped out of my car, I noticed Howard's curtain twitch ever so slightly. And in that fleeting moment, I caught a glimpse of a warm, flickering glow inside. Candlelight. Curiosity, or perhaps a morbid sense of dread, froze me in place. Through the narrow gap in the curtain, I saw his living room wall. It was completely covered with photographs, dozens of them. My stomach plummeted when I realized they weren't family portraits. They were pictures of Claire and me. Leaving for groceries, engaging in casual porch conversations, Claire studying diligently by the window. And then, as if he sensed my presence, the curtain snapped shut. Sleep eluded me that night. I desperately tried to convince myself that I'd imagined it. That the candlelight had distorted the images. But deep down, I knew the truth. And I couldn't bear to tell Claire, not with her exams looming. She was already anxious, already on edge because of the incessant knocking in the walls. Instead, I quietly purchased a small door camera online, rationalizing it as a measure against package theft. I installed it above our front door one afternoon when Claire was at her clinical rotation, telling her it was just to deter package thieves. The footage I reviewed 2 nights later sent a wave of icy dread through my veins. At 3:47 a.m., Howard shuffled up to our door in his slippers. He leaned down, pressed his ear against the wood, and remained there for almost a full minute, breathing, listening, intruding. Then, as casually as if he were checking the weather, he stood up and walked away. The following morning, my composure crumbled. I confronted him as he was watering his roses. "What the hell were you doing outside our door last night?" I snapped, my voice barely controlled. Howard blinked, his watery eyes unnervingly calm. "Checking for drafts," he replied. "Old houses like this, air seeps through the cracks." "That's not your job," I retorted, barely able to contain my anger. He tilted his head slightly, his voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial whisper. "You should be more grateful, Ryan. I see things before you do." Then, he offered a faint, chilling smile and retreated inside, shutting the door firmly behind him. I told Claire that night, showed her the chilling footage. She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. "We have to tell someone," she pleaded, her voice laced with desperation. "The landlord, the police, I don't care. He's watching us." So, we called the police. An officer arrived, spoke briefly with Howard, and returned with a dismissive shrug. "He's harmless," the officer said with an air of nonchalance. "A little eccentric, maybe, but it's not against the law to stand in his yard or in the shared hallway." Claire stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "He's stalking us." The officer sighed, clearly impatient. "Look, unless he makes a direct threat, our hands are tied. There's nothing we can do." For weeks, I barely slept, every creak and groan of the old house amplified in the silence. Claire swore she could hear whispers through the wall when I was at work, even her own name being uttered. We began keeping every light in the house on, a feeble attempt to ward off the encroaching darkness. I kept a baseball bat by the bed, a grim comfort in the face of the unknown. Then, one morning, I opened the mailbox to find a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in shaky, uneven handwriting. "You leave at 6:42 a.m., it read. "She leaves at 7:15 a.m., don't change your routine." My hands trembled uncontrollably as I read the words. He was tracking us, meticulously documenting our every move. He knew exactly when we came and went. I immediately showed the note to the police, hoping for a different response, a glimmer of understanding. But I was met with the same disheartening answer: no direct threat, nothing they could do. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was no longer harmless. By November, the fear had become a constant, oppressive presence. We lived with it the way you live with chronic pain, a dull, persistent ache that never truly disappears. Nights were the worst, particularly when I was at work, leaving Claire alone and vulnerable. She would text me incessantly, reporting imagined footsteps in the hall, the unsettling sound of the television emanating from Howard's unit at 4 a.m., the faint, lingering smell of candle wax seeping through the walls. One night, she called me, sobbing hysterically. "I swear I heard him whisper my name, Ryan," she choked out, her voice thick with fear. "He was right behind the wall. I could hear him breathing." I desperately wanted to quit my job, to protect her, but we simply couldn't afford it. Instead, I began coming home on my lunch breaks, driving 20 minutes each way just to check on her, to reassure myself that she was safe. Every time, without fail, I would catch Howard peeking through his curtain, his gaze fixed on our unit, always watching. The breaking point arrived on a stormy November night. The power went out across the street, plunging the neighborhood into darkness. The rain was pounding relentlessly, the thunder echoing ominously. I'd just returned from checking the breaker when I saw Claire standing in the living room, her face as pale as chalk, clutching a flickering candle. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm, pointing towards the window. I turned, and there he was. Howard stood inches from the glass, the rain streaming down his face, plastering his hair to his forehead. A twisted, unsettling smile stretched across his lips. He didn't move when I yelled at him, my voice raw with rage and fear. He didn't flinch when I pounded on the window, my fists impacting the glass with desperate force. He simply stood there, smiling that unnerving smile. It wasn't until another car's headlights illuminated the street, our neighbors returning home, that he finally retreated into the shadows. We barely slept that night, huddled together in fear. Claire begged me to leave, to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the duplex, but we had nowhere else to go. Our lease wasn't up, and we couldn't afford to break it without incurring significant penalties. So, we endured, clinging to the hope that somehow, the nightmare would end. Then, 2 weeks later, Howard moved out, just like that. No goodbye, no explanation, no forwarding address. The landlord simply informed us that he was gone. But the mystery surrounding Howard Green was only just beginning. When the landlord agreed to let us peek inside the empty unit, I expected to find clutter, perhaps stacks of old newspapers or empty bottles. Instead, it was spotless, unnaturally so. No dishes, no clothes, no furniture. It was as if he'd never truly lived there. But the spare bedroom told a different story, a story etched into the very walls. The wallpaper was faded in neat, rectangular shapes, like dozens of picture frames had hung there for years. The outlines covered every wall, a ghostly gallery of absent images. Photos, I thought, all carefully removed. I searched the room for hours, desperately hoping to find a single shred of proof, something tangible to show the police, something to explain why Howard had spent months watching us, meticulously documenting our lives. But the room was bare, devoid of any clues. That night, Claire asked me, her voice barely a whisper, "Do you think he's still watching us?" I didn't know what to say, the fear still a tangible presence in the room. We moved out the following spring, finding an apartment across town, closer to our respective work. Life went on. We desperately tried to put Cedar Falls behind us, to erase the memories of Hawthorne Street, but they stubbornly persisted. I still check my porch light every night before bed. I still scan my blinds twice before leaving the house. And every now and then, when I'm walking to my car in the early morning, I swear I can feel those pale blue eyes on me, watching, judging. Years have passed. Claire and I are happily married now, living in a different state, a different home. On the surface, life is normal, but the scars from that small, unassuming duplex remain. Howard Green never resurfaced, vanishing without a trace. No police report ever tied him to another incident. Maybe he died. Maybe he simply moved on to another town, another set of unsuspecting neighbors to watch. What I know, with unwavering certainty, is this: safety is a fragile illusion. We convince ourselves that we're secure, protected by locks, cameras, and community watch programs. But all it takes is one neighbor with too much time and too much obsession to unravel it all. I tell this story because people need to pay attention to the small signs, the subtle indicators that something is amiss. The umbrella moved, the light unscrewed, the footsteps in the hall. We brushed them off, dismissing them as insignificant until it was too late. The moral I carry with me is simple: trust your instincts. Don't let politeness or denial blind you to the truth. When something feels wrong in your own home, act. Protect yourself. Even if others dismiss it, even if they tell you that you're being paranoid. Because in the end, it wasn't the blatant acts of intrusion that haunted me. It was lying awake at night, knowing that a man just inches away was listening, watching, waiting for the right moment. And the unsettling truth is, sometimes you never truly know if he's really gone. I was 25 years old when I first signed the lease for that little townhouse on Cypress Grove Court in Raleigh, North Carolina. Looking back now, I can still vividly picture the row of modest attached homes, lined up like polite neighbors who barely acknowledged each other's existence. Each unit boasted the same beige siding, the same meager patches of grass, and a parking lot out front where the asphalt was just beginning to show the wear and tear of time. It wasn't the type of place that impressed anyone, but it was quiet, affordable, and, most importantly, it was mine. At that particular juncture in my life, I was desperate for space, for solitude that didn't come with the baggage of roommates. I'd spent years living with friends in cramped apartments, enduring the endless cycle of dirty dishes, missed rent payments, and the constant noise of someone else's life intruding upon mine. I craved independence, the simple pleasure of waking up, pouring my coffee, and sitting in silence without tripping over someone else's shoes. Most of the residents on Cypress Grove were either young professionals like myself, just starting out in their careers, or older couples who had downsized, seeking a simpler, less demanding lifestyle. The overall vibe of the place was polite but distant, a community of individuals who valued their privacy. You'd offer a brief wave when someone was carrying groceries, a polite nod when walking to your car, maybe exchange a quick "good evening" in passing, but that was the extent of the interaction. I actually preferred it that way, finding solace in the quiet anonymity of suburban life. That's precisely why my neighbor, Mike Carver, stood out so much, a stark contrast to the prevailing atmosphere of detached politeness. Mike was in his mid-40s, with sandy brown hair that was beginning to show streaks of gray, a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow that gave him a slightly rugged appearance, and a kind of forced friendliness that, at first, seemed genuinely neighborly. He waved enthusiastically when I moved in, offered to lend me a toolbox when he saw me struggling to hang curtains, and even helped me carry a particularly heavy box inside, insisting it was no trouble at all. I initially chalked it up to him being one of those inherently helpful guys, the kind who derive satisfaction from lending a hand. But there was always something a little too much about him, a subtle undercurrent that made me slightly uneasy. He asked too many questions, prying into the details of my job, whether I lived alone, how late I usually stayed out. I initially dismissed it as harmless small talk, until one day, he grinned and casually remarked, "So, you leave around 7:15 every morning, huh? And you're back by 6 most nights." He said it as if he was proud of himself for noticing, as if he'd cracked some kind of code. But the hair on the back of my neck stood up, a primal instinct signaling danger. That wasn't small talk, that was surveillance. I tried to brush it off, reasoning that people inevitably noticed things about their neighbors, that it didn't necessarily imply malicious intent. But the way he looked at me, the way he lingered on his porch whenever I left or came home, a silent observer in my daily routine, it started to gnaw at me, a persistent unease that I couldn't quite shake. Still, I stubbornly clung to the belief that I was being paranoid, that I was overreacting to a simple act of neighborly awareness. It was just a townhouse, I told myself, just a neighbor, just a series of coincidences. That fragile illusion shattered one spring night when I pulled into the parking lot later than usual, the events of a stressful day still weighing heavily on my mind. My headlights swept across the back fence of my small, fenced-in yard, and in that fleeting moment, I caught a glimpse of a figure leaping over it, disappearing into the shadows. My heart stopped, a surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I parked crookedly, abandoning any pretense of order, jumped out of the car, and ran towards the gate that led to the alleyway. But by the time I reached it, whoever it was had vanished into the darkness, leaving no trace of their presence. My chest heaved as I scanned the alley behind the row of townhouses, desperately searching for any sign of the intruder. Empty, silent, and eerily still. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that maybe it was just a teenager cutting through the yards, taking a shortcut home. Maybe it was someone drunk, who had simply gotten lost. But deep down, I felt the truth pressing against my chest, a heavy weight of dread. I already knew who it was. The next morning, I attempted to feign nonchalance, hoping to glean some information without revealing my suspicions. Mike was outside, meticulously watering the small, carefully manicured patch of shrubs in front of his unit, a task he seemed to perform with almost ritualistic precision. I walked over, pretending to stretch, and casually asked, "Hey, did you happen to see anyone hanging around my yard last night? Looked like somebody jumped the fence." He didn't even blink, his expression remaining impassive. He simply stared at me with a strange, unreadable glint in his eyes. "You probably imagined it," he said flatly, his voice devoid of any warmth or concern. Then, before I could formulate a response, his tone sharpened, a subtle shift that betrayed his underlying anxiety. "Why would you think it was me?" The knot in my stomach twisted tighter, a sharp stab of fear. I hadn't explicitly accused him of anything, hadn't even hinted at my suspicions. I had simply asked a question. But his reaction felt immediate, defensive, almost rehearsed. From that moment onward, everything changed. He started watching me more openly, abandoning any pretense of subtlety. Every morning, he stood on his porch with a cup of coffee, his gaze unwavering, following me until I drove away, his presence a constant reminder of his silent scrutiny. If I happened to come home earlier than usual, I'd catch his blinds twitching, a fleeting glimpse of a shadow disappearing behind the window, confirming my suspicions. I desperately wanted to confront him again, to demand an explanation, to put an end to the escalating tension. But I could already hear his inevitable denial, already picture the way he'd twist the situation around, making me feel like I was the one in the wrong, like I was the one being unreasonable. A few weeks later, my friend Samantha came over for the weekend, seeking a temporary escape from her own chaotic life. We stayed up late, sitting on the couch with a bottle of wine, half watching a rerun of some crime show, attempting to unwind and forget our troubles. Around midnight, A sound outside cut through the quiet of the night, a distinct scraping noise near my car that instantly put me on edge. Sam froze, her eyes widening with alarm. "Someone's out there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. We cautiously crept to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside without being seen. Two men stood by my car, one shining a flashlight inside, illuminating the interior. My breath caught in my throat, a wave of nausea washing over me as I recognized the taller man's profile. "Mike," Sam whispered, her voice trembling, "is that your neighbor?" Before I could answer, the adrenaline took over, fueling a surge of reckless courage. I yanked open the door and shouted, "Hey! What the hell are you doing?" The men froze, startled by my sudden outburst. Mike slowly turned his head, his eyes meeting mine, and then, without uttering a single word, he walked back to his townhouse, disappearing into the darkness. The other guy, a shadowy figure I didn't recognize, quickly jogged off into the night, vanishing without a trace. Sam's hands were shaking uncontrollably as she dialed 911, her voice barely above a whisper. The police arrived 20 minutes later, their demeanor bored and unimpressed. They knocked on Mike's door, but he never answered, feigning ignorance. I explained what we had seen, gave them Mike's name and address, described the other man as best I could. The officer nodded, but seemed unconvinced, his eyes conveying a clear message of skepticism. "Did they damage the car? Take anything?" he asked, his voice almost dismissive. "No," I admitted, "but without a crime, there's not much we can do." "We'll keep an eye out," he said, his tone suggesting that he was simply going through the motions, that he didn't believe my story. Sam glared at him, her frustration palpable, whispering to me after they left, "Don't be alone with him, ever." I didn't sleep that night, every creak in the walls amplified in the silence, every shadow seeming to hold a sinister presence. The thin drywall felt inadequate, unable to possibly protect me from the man who lived just one unit away, the man who I knew was watching, waiting. The next morning, I found something on my windshield, a small, folded piece of paper with no envelope. Inside, in blocky, uneven handwriting, was a phone number and a chilling message, "Call me. We need to talk." My stomach dropped, a wave of cold dread washing over me. I didn't need to guess who it was from. I showed it to Sam before she left, her expression hardening with concern. "Do not call him," she said firmly. "Promise me." I reluctantly promised, but curiosity, a dangerous and irresistible force, clawed at me, whispering insidious questions in my mind. That afternoon, unable to resist the urge, I typed the phone number into a search bar, hoping to glean some information, anything that could shed light on the situation. My hands went cold when the results popped up. It belonged to a local middle school, listed in the faculty directory. Mike Carver, social studies teacher. The thought of him lurking around my car at midnight, engaging in potentially criminal activity, and then walking into a classroom full of innocent children the next morning, made me physically sick. I considered reporting him to the school, alerting the authorities to his disturbing behavior. But what did I have to go on? A note, a bad feeling, no concrete proof. It would be my word against his, and I feared I would come off looking paranoid, unstable, someone to be dismissed. The following weeks were suffocating, the tension building with each passing day. He never mentioned the note, never asked if I had called, but the way he watched me, the intensity of his gaze, said enough. If I came home late, he was there on the porch, a silent sentinel observing my every move. If I left early, his blinds parted just enough for me to see a shadow, a fleeting glimpse confirming that he was always watching. I started avoiding my own house, seeking refuge elsewhere. I stayed late at work, inventing errands just to kill time, anything to avoid the oppressive atmosphere of Cypress Grove Court. When I did finally come home, I parked at the far end of the lot, deliberately choosing a spot that forced me to walk past his porch, forcing me to confront the source of my fear. But even then, even when I pretended not to notice him, I could feel his eyes on me, burning through the darkness, following my every step. At night, I obsessively locked every window, checked the deadbolt 3 times, a futile attempt to create a sense of security. I kept a heavy wrench by my bed, a makeshift weapon to defend myself against the unknown. Sleep became a stranger, eluding me night after night, replaced by a constant state of hypervigilance. And through it all, the police never called back, their indifference a stark reminder that I was on my own. It didn't take long for my townhouse to feel less like a home and more like a trap, a gilded cage from which there was no escape. I lived in constant dread, waiting for the next note, the next scrape at my car, the next shadow moving outside my window, the next sign that Mike's obsession was escalating. I avoided inviting anyone over, unwilling to expose my friends to the suffocating tension, the creeping fear that seeped through the walls. Even phone calls became difficult. I didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to admit how unsafe I felt in the place I'd fought so hard to afford on my own, the place that was supposed to be my sanctuary. Every time I saw Mike, I felt smaller, weaker, more vulnerable. He didn't need to say anything, his silence was more terrifying than any threat. A slow, knowing stare when I walked by, a faint smile when I pretended not to notice him, it was like he was daring me to say something, daring me to accuse him, knowing that nobody would believe me, knowing that I was powerless. Finally, I reached my breaking point, the weight of fear becoming too much to bear. I called my landlord, explained that I needed to break the lease early, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of Cypress Grove Court. He wasn't happy, balking at the suggestion, but I agreed to pay a substantial penalty fee, sacrificing a significant portion of my savings for the promise of freedom. It was worth every dollar, a small price to pay for my peace of mind. Packing up my belongings felt like escaping a war zone, each box I taped shut a symbolic act of reclaiming my life. Every trip I made to the car, I half expected Mike to appear, to say something to stop me, to somehow prevent me from leaving. But he never did. He just stood on his porch, watching, his presence a silent, menacing threat. That faint smirk never leaving his face, a constant reminder of his power over me. When I finally pulled away from Cypress Grove Court, my car loaded with the pieces of my life, the relief was overwhelming, a physical sensation of release. For the first time in months, I could breathe freely, the oppressive weight of fear lifted from my shoulders. It's been years since I left that townhouse, since I last saw Mike Carver. I live in a different city now, in an apartment where I barely know my neighbors, and that's exactly how I want it. But sometimes, late at night, when I see a shadow in the parking lot or hear a scrape outside my window, my heart still races, the memories of Cypress Grove Court flooding back with terrifying clarity. I can't shake the feeling that people like Mike don't just disappear, that they simply move on, blending into new surroundings, finding new neighbors to watch, new victims to torment. I think about that note sometimes, the one that said, "Call me. We need to talk." What would have happened if I had called? Would he have tried to pull me closer, to involve me in something darker, something more sinister? Or was it just another way to tighten the leash, to remind me that he was in control, that he knew I was scared and powerless? What unsettles me most isn't what happened during my time at Cypress Grove Court, it's what didn't. The police never took me seriously, dismissing my fears as paranoia. The school never knew about Mike's disturbing behavior, never had the chance to intervene. Mike never faced any consequences for his actions, never had to account for the fear he inflicted. He simply walked back into his job, back into his life, back into a classroom full of innocent children, as if the nights of lurking and watching had never happened, as if his actions had no impact. The moral I carry from that time is harsh but true: not everyone who seems friendly has good intentions. Pay attention to the small details, the questions that dig too deep, the patterns that don't feel right. And when your instincts tell you that something is wrong, don't ignore them, don't dismiss them as paranoia. Because the scariest neighbors aren't the ones who make noise or cause trouble, the ones who are outwardly disruptive. It's the ones who smile, who seem helpful, who watch quietly from behind the blinds, their motives hidden, their intentions unknown. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing about them is knowing that no one else will ever believe you, that you're completely alone in your fear. I vividly remember the first time I sensed the subtle shift in our neighborhood's atmosphere. Maplewood Heights, nestled in the heart of Neepville, Illinois, had always been the quintessential American suburb, the kind of place where parents casually chatted across white picket fences, kids played freely until sunset cast long shadows, and the air carried the comforting scent of freshly cut grass mingling with the sweet aroma of blooming azaleas. I was 14 years old at the time, and to me, life was blissfully simple: school, video games, riding bikes with my friends, and helping my mom bake cookies in the afternoons, a comforting routine that defined my world. My younger sister, Sophie, who was 10, was my constant sidekick, always eager to join in my adventures. Our parents, my dad, a civil engineer, and my mom, a small-town baker, effortlessly balanced work and family life, creating an idyllic home environment. Our bubble of normalcy seemed impenetrable, destined to last forever. Then, Greg Turner moved in next door, shattering our illusion of suburban tranquility. I didn't pay him much attention at first. He was polite, offering a friendly smile whenever we waved, seemingly the kind of neighbor who would seamlessly integrate into the community. But there was something about the way he looked at us, at our house, a lingering gaze that made my stomach churn with an unsettling premonition. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed a stare that lingered too long, as if he was meticulously cataloging us, assessing our vulnerabilities. The first incident was almost laughable, a minor neighborly dispute that seemed insignificant at the time, at least on the surface. My dad had inadvertently let the garden hose stray into Greg's flower bed while watering the lawn, a careless mistake that had unintended consequences. Greg came storming over, his face flushed with anger, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the entire street. "Do you have any idea how long it takes to cultivate my azaleas?" he barked, his words dripping with resentment. My dad, ever the peacemaker, responded in a calm, measured tone. "I'm sorry, Greg. It was an accident. I'll gladly pay for the damage." Greg muttered something unintelligible under his breath and retreated to his yard, his anger palpable. The air, once filled with the comforting scent of blooming flowers, now felt thick with tension. That night, as I lay in bed, with Sophie snuggled close beside me, I couldn't shake the image of Greg's angry glare. The soft rustle of leaves outside my window only amplified my unease. "It's just a neighbor," I told myself, desperately trying to reassure myself that I was overreacting. Just a grumpy neighbor with a penchant for perfect azaleas. But my gut whispered otherwise, a persistent voice of warning that I couldn't ignore. Over the next week, the little things started, subtle signs that something was amiss. Greg parked unusually close to our driveway, as if deliberately trying to intimidate us. He lingered in his car long after sunset, his presence a constant, unsettling reminder that we were being watched. There were unexplained footsteps on the sidewalk late at night when no one should have been there. A window across the street catching a reflection that seemed too deliberate, too calculated, as if someone was intentionally monitoring our movements. Sophie noticed it first, her innocent eyes picking up on details that I initially dismissed as coincidence. "Liam, he's staring again," she whispered one evening while we were playing in the yard, her voice laced with a childlike fear that mirrored my own. "Probably just bored," I tried to reassure her, forcing a lightness into my voice that I didn't feel. But even to my own ears, my words sounded hollow, lacking conviction. That night, my dad picked up the landline to make a call, only to be met with an unsettling silence, broken only by faint breathing, and then a chilling whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. "You'll see," the disembodied voice rasped, leaving a lingering sense of dread. We didn't talk about it much, trying to downplay the incident and maintain a semblance of normalcy. Mom insisted it was just a prank call, a random act of senselessness. But the atmosphere in our house had already irrevocably changed, the carefree joy replaced by a subtle undercurrent of unease. Maplewood Heights wasn't quite as safe as it had seemed, the illusion of suburban paradise shattered. And deep down, I knew this wasn't going to be a one-off incident, that Greg Turner's arrival had set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter our lives. After that first week, fear settled over our home like a layer of dust, coating everything with a fine layer of anxiety. I started noticing patterns, small, unsettling details that made me jump even before they happened. Greg's car would mysteriously appear whenever we were outside, only to disappear when we retreated indoors. Packages would be left at the curb seemed subtly altered upon our return from the mailbox, as though reality itself was rearranging. Shadows danced with a disquieting energy at the edge of our vision, playing tricks on our perception. One evening, Sophie and I were lost in a game of hide-and-seek, her laughter echoing through the twilight. I stood counting near the porch, the rhythmic numbers of familiar comfort, when a piercing scream shattered the tranquility. I bolted upstairs, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and froze. Greg was there, across the street, a dark silhouette against the fading light, his eyes fixed on Sophie's bedroom window. A chill ran down my spine as I shouted, my voice raw with anger and fear, "Get away from here!" He responded with a slow, deliberate smile, a chillingly calculated expression that sent shivers down my spine. He raised a finger to his lips, silencing me, before casually strolling away as if nothing had occurred. Dad, his face grim, filed a complaint with the police, but without concrete evidence of a crime, their hands were tied. I watched, helpless, as our home transformed into a stage for subtle terror, a slow burn of fear that seeped into every corner. Mom, bless her heart, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, filling the house with the aroma of freshly baked cookies and forcing laughter at dinner-table jokes, but the tension lingered, an invisible but heavy presence that permeated everything. Sophie refused to venture outside, her bright spirit dimmed by fear, and even Dad, usually unflappable, began leaving for work earlier, his eyes nervously scanning the driveway before pulling away. Late one night, the noises returned, soft at first, like whispers in the dark. The scraping of shoes against gravel, the hesitant creak of our gate, each sound a hammer blow to my already frayed nerves. I peeked through the blinds, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my chest. A shadow moved near the backyard fence, a dark figure lurking in the periphery. Too far to make out details, but close enough to send tremors of fear through my hands. That was the first night I truly understood that Greg was more than just a nuisance next door. He had singled us out, made us a target, and it felt, with sickening certainty, like he was always watching, always waiting for the opportune moment. The arrival of the package marked a darker turn, a descent into the abyss of terror. A manila envelope, ominous in its plainness, was slipped under the door. My mother, her face paling, opened it first, her hands shaking so violently I thought she might drop it. Inside were papers, cruel imitations of legal documents, accusing Dad of trespassing and claiming that Sophie's beloved treehouse violated some imaginary ordinance. A typed note, devoid of warmth or humanity, accompanied the documents. "Do not test me. I watch. I wait. I know everything. Keep your family in line." The words, cold and precise, burned into our minds, branding us with fear. That night, sleep was a distant memory. Sophie curled into my side, trembling like a frightened bird, whispering, "He's going to get us." Dad, his face etched with worry, called the police again. Security cameras were installed, their unblinking eyes watching over our home. A private investigator, a shadowy figure himself, staked out the house, meticulously documenting every movement. The footage showed Greg lurking in the shadows, a ghost-like presence that vanished whenever approached, but never committing any tangible crime. He wasn't just tormenting us, he was teaching us to fear, and with each passing day, his lesson was taking hold. Every day felt like running a gauntlet, each step fraught with unseen danger. Every creak, every cough from the street sent shivers down my spine, freezing me in place. I started walking Sophie to school, my senses on high alert, checking every corner, every neighbor's yard, every parked car for any sign of him. But Greg always found a way to make his presence known, to remind us that he was there, watching. Sometimes in the most mundane, unsettling moments, waiting by the mailbox, parked outside a friend's house, a silent, malevolent observer. It was relentless, a psychological assault that never ceased. Weeks bled into months, and the unease became a horrifying routine. One night, around midnight, Sophie's scream ripped through the silence, tearing me from sleep. My heart nearly stopped, a violent lurch in my chest. I sprinted down the hall and saw him, bathed in the eerie glow of the porch light, a knife glinting in his hand, a soft, chilling laughter escaping his lips. Dad, fueled by rage and fear, grabbed a baseball bat and charged, but Greg vanished before he could reach him, melting into the darkness like a phantom. That was the moment we truly realized that there was no reasoning, no negotiating with someone like Greg. Cameras, police, and precautions could only do so much. The terror he inflicted was psychological, a masterful manipulation of our deepest fears, and he controlled it effortlessly. Life became a series of carefully orchestrated routines, designed to avoid any encounter with him. We double-checked locks, rerouted our trips, and avoided any unnecessary exposure to the outside world. Friends visited less often, sensing the palpable tension that we could no longer hide. Sleep became a battlefield, a constant struggle against nightmares and imagined threats. Even our home, once a sanctuary, felt like a cage, its walls closing in on us. Eventually, we made the agonizing decision to move to another part of town, hoping that distance could erase the fear that had taken root in our hearts. But the memories lingered, tenacious vines that refused to be uprooted. I still find myself checking the darkened windows of neighbors, imagining eyes watching, calculating, plotting. Sophie still jumps at shadows in her new room, her innocent spirit forever scarred. Dad still hesitates before leaving for work, his gaze scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. Mom bakes less frequently, her joy dimmed by the weight of what happened. The moral of our ordeal is painfully clear: danger doesn't always come with a dramatic confrontation, a clash of wills in the broad light of day. Sometimes it is patient, subtle, and calculated, a slow erosion of safety that chips away at your sanity. Evil can lurk behind a polite smile, in the neighbor next door, or in anyone who seems normal at first glance. And when it chooses to strike, it doesn't always need to cross the line of legality. Sometimes it simply erodes your sense of safety day by day, shadow by shadow, until the world you once trusted becomes unrecognizable. We learned that vigilance, awareness, and trust in your intuition are as crucial as any lock or alarm system. And sometimes, the hardest truth to accept is that fear doesn't always disappear, even when the threat does. The echoes of terror can linger long after the storm has passed, a constant reminder of the fragility of peace. I never imagined that a simple move-in day could unravel everything, transforming my life into a chilling nightmare. Cedar Grove in Burlington, Vermont, seemed like the epitome of tranquility, the kind of apartment complex that exuded a sleepy yet safe atmosphere. Rows of beige buildings, nestled amidst towering maple and oak trees, their leaves crunching underfoot in the crisp autumn air. I'd lived in apartment 3B for 3 years, diligently carving out a routine that perfectly balanced my graduate studies, thesis work, and quiet nights spent in the comforting company of my cat, Whiskers. My boyfriend, Ethan, often visited on weekends, but for the most part, I cherished my solitude, finding solace in the predictable rhythm of my days. My life felt contained, predictable, and above all, safe. Then Luke Preston arrived, shattering the illusion of peace and security. It started innocuously enough. I noticed the U-Haul van one afternoon, bright orange and clumsily parked near the lobby, a jarring splash of color against the muted tones of the complex. A young man, seemingly in his mid-20s, struggled with a stack of boxes, his face flushed with exertion. He eventually introduced himself with a nervous smile, his eyes darting around as he spoke. "Hey, I'm Luke. Just moved in across the hall." I offered a polite wave, thinking little of it. Polite, awkward, young, he seemed like the type of neighbor you nodded to in passing and promptly forgot about. But over the next few days, my sense of calm began to fray, unraveling thread by thread. I noticed him lingering outside, sometimes just standing beneath my window, his gaze fixed on my apartment. Perhaps it was just a coincidence, I told myself, trying to rationalize my unease. Maybe he was stretching his legs, taking in the crisp autumn air. But the instinct in my gut, that primal warning system that screams when something isn't right, refused to be silenced. The first truly alarming moment arrived at night, a week after he moved in. I was grading papers and sipping coffee, the silence broken only by the gentle hum of the lamp, when a soft rustling caught my attention. I cautiously peered through the blinds and froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. Luke was perched in the giant maple tree outside my bedroom, motionless, his eyes locked on mine. He was staring at me. "Ethan, you won't believe this," I whispered into the phone, my voice trembling, barely audible above the frantic pounding of my heart. By the time Ethan arrived, Luke had vanished, slipping away like smoke into the night. I reported the incident to the apartment office, my voice shaking as I recounted the chilling encounter. "Maybe he was pruning the tree," the manager said dismissively, his tone implying I was overreacting. But my gut screamed no. Evenings became a subtle game of fear, a constant dance with the unknown. Small, unsettling objects began appearing outside my door, rocks, leaves, a single glove arranged in patterns that made my skin crawl. Shadows under the window moved at odd times, defying logic and reason. Every glance from a balcony across the hall seemed deliberate, laden with a hidden meaning that I couldn't decipher. I began noticing small details, insignificant on their own, but unsettling when pieced together. How Luke's eyes lingered just a fraction too long when he thought I wasn't looking. How he sometimes loitered near my mailbox, seemingly without purpose. The sense of being watched grew heavier with each day, a suffocating weight that pressed down on me. I tried rationalizing it at first, clinging to the hope that I was simply overreacting, that my imagination was running wild. Maybe I was imagining things, conjuring threats where none existed. But that fragile illusion of normalcy shattered one evening around 10:30 p.m. Ethan and I were walking back from the library, books clutched in our hands, when Luke emerged from behind a hedge, his silhouette stark against the streetlight. "Hey," he said casually, too casually, his voice dripping with an unsettling familiarity. "Nice night, isn't it?" There was something inherently wrong with the way he smiled, a disconnect between his lips and his eyes. His eyes didn't match the grin, holding a coldness that belied the pleasantry. Ethan, sensing my unease, kept walking, trying to ignore him, but Luke adjusted his pace to match ours, his presence a palpable weight beside us. My voice shook when I finally spoke, forcing the words out. "Nice to meet you again." He didn't reply, just walked alongside us, his silence more menacing than any threat, until we reached the building. And even then, the unease didn't dissipate. It lingered, a dark cloud hanging over us. That night, I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with anxieties. Whiskers, usually a picture of feline serenity, refused to settle, his ears twitching at every creak and groan of the building. Shadows in the room seemed alive, morphing into grotesque shapes in the periphery of my vision. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that perhaps he just wanted to make friends, however awkwardly. But deep down, I knew the truth. He had chosen to make me aware of him, to assert a presence that was intrusive, predatory in its subtlety. Weeks passed, and Luke's intrusions became more deliberate, more unsettling. I awoke one rainy night to a soft scratching at the window, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. I peeked through the blinds and nearly dropped the phone in terror. Luke was in the tree again, perched high above the ground, staring down at me with an unnerving intensity. Panic surged through me, a tidal wave of fear. I called 911, my fingers trembling as I dialed the numbers. By the time the officers arrived, he was gone, vanished into the night. No trace, no explanation, only the lingering sense of being hunted, the chilling knowledge that I was no longer safe in my own home. I installed blackout curtains, motion sensors, cameras, transforming my apartment into a fortress against an unseen enemy. Ethan accompanied me whenever I left the apartment, his presence a comforting shield against the encroaching darkness. Every step outside was calculated, every shadow a potential threat. The unsettling objects reappeared on my doorstep, stones, twigs, cryptic notes that fueled my paranoia. "I see you," one read, the words a chilling reminder of his constant surveillance. My sanctuary felt violated in ways I couldn't fight directly, a slow, insidious erosion of my sense of security. Even the apartment office confronted him, spurred by my persistent complaints. Luke offered vague explanations, claiming misunderstandings, apologizing profusely, but my instincts told me otherwise. He had tested boundaries, recognized my fear, and learned how to impose it without crossing legal lines, a master manipulator of psychological terror. Living like that was suffocating, a constant state of high alert. I avoided the balcony, stopped walking alone to the mailbox, and slept with the lights on, my eyes darting to every shadow. Even Ethan's presence couldn't erase the dread that crept into every corner of the apartment, poisoning the atmosphere. Whiskers hissed at corners where nothing existed, his feline senses picking up on the unseen menace. I began questioning my own sanity, wondering if I was simply losing my grip on reality. The psychological weight of it became unbearable when a note slipped under my door, its message a chilling affirmation of my deepest fears. "I know your schedule. I see everything." The words carved a chill deep into my bones, a cold dread that settled in my stomach. It wasn't just curiosity, it was control, manipulation, a deliberate attempt to strip me of my agency. Luke had created a constant atmosphere of anxiety, making me hyper-aware of every detail, every sound, every shadow. Eventually, Ethan and I made the difficult decision to move to a different part of Burlington, seeking refuge from the torment. We changed apartments, routines, even phone numbers, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. But the fear didn't leave immediately. I still jump at shadows, still check the corners of rooms before settling in, my senses on high alert. Whiskers reacts instinctively, hissing at empty spaces, a permanent reminder of the terror we endured. The moral is stark: danger doesn't always need force to be harmful. Sometimes terror is psychological, exerted through observation, intrusion, and calculated intimidation, a slow erosion of your sanity. Trust your instincts, maintain your boundaries, and understand that feeling unsafe isn't paranoia. It can be survival, a vital warning sign. Even when a threat leaves physically, its echoes remain, haunting your memories and shaping your perceptions. I learned that fear isn't just in actions, it's in presence, intention, and the invisible weight someone can place on your life. And sometimes, the most chilling danger is not what you see, but what you feel is always watching, a constant, unseen observer. Moving to Crestwood Heights had felt like the perfect fresh start, a chance to rebuild my life in a peaceful environment. Portland, Maine in winter possessed a crisp stillness, a serene beauty that soothed my weary soul. The streets, blanketed with a thin layer of snow, muffled the usual city noise, creating an atmosphere of tranquility. At 25, I'd grown tired of the chaos of college towns and craved a calm place where I could settle into my work as a remote graphic designer. Apartment 2D seemed ideal, small but cozy, with a view of a quiet courtyard lined with frost-tipped evergreens, a picturesque scene that promised peace and serenity. I even adopted a golden retriever, Bailey, just for company, seeking the unconditional love and companionship of a furry friend. Life was predictable, safe, and structured, and I loved it that way, relishing the routine and stability. Then Eli Gardner moved in next door, shattering the illusion of peace and injecting a dose of chilling unease into my life. He appeared one morning with a moving truck, a polite smile plastered on his face, seemingly just another ordinary resident. On first impression, he seemed ordinary, polite, slightly reserved, maybe even shy, the kind of neighbor you wouldn't give a second thought. I introduced myself, even offered him a plate of freshly baked cookies, extending a gesture of welcome. He smiled, nodded, and thanked me, his demeanor perfectly pleasant. But something about the way his eyes darted, flicking across my apartment windows as if memorizing every detail, unsettled me, sending a shiver of unease down my spine. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things, that my anxieties were getting the better of me. Maybe it was the long winter shadows or the quiet of the building playing tricks on my senses. It started small, subtle intrusions that I initially dismissed as coincidences. Late evenings, I would notice him sitting on his balcony, perfectly still, staring intently. I waved awkwardly, forcing a smile. He smiled politely in return, but the intensity of his gaze left a cold feeling in my chest, a sense of being observed with an unsettling purpose. I brushed it off as coincidence, convincing myself that maybe he simply enjoyed the winter nights, or that I was just being paranoid. The building itself didn't help, exacerbating my anxieties. Old walls, thin insulation, a creaky stairwell that sounded like it was groaning with every step, amplified every sound and shadow, creating an atmosphere of unease. At night, when I worked late on designs, I would hear soft knocks or thuds from the apartment next door, sounds that seemed deliberate. Sometimes it was whispers, unintelligible, but close enough to make me jump, my heart leaping into my throat. Bailey would stiffen, his ears perked, growling at nothing, his canine instincts sensing something amiss. It made me question whether I was overthinking things or if there really was something off about Eli, a subtle wrongness that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The first major incident came a week later, shattering my sense of security. I returned home late one night from a client call, a mug of coffee still warm in my hands, seeking the comfort of my familiar surroundings. My door was slightly ajar, a chilling sight that sent a wave of panic washing over me. Heart pounding, I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Everything inside seemed in place, nothing obviously disturbed. Nothing was missing, no signs of forced entry. I slammed the door shut and triple-checked the locks, my stomach tight with fear. The following morning, fueled by a mixture of fear and anger, I confronted Eli, determined to get answers. My door. It was open last night, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the lingering panic that threatened to overwhelm me. He shrugged casually, smiling too broadly, his eyes devoid of any genuine concern. Must have been the wind. Old building, you know. But I wasn't convinced. Something about the calm in his tone, the lack of concern in his eyes, felt deliberate, a calculated attempt to dismiss my fears. From that night onward, my sense of security dissolved into a quiet tension that never left, a constant state of unease. Shadows seemed sharper, darker, more menacing. Every hallway corner held the potential for danger, every creak of the building amplified by my heightened senses. And I realized, with a chilling certainty, that my once safe apartment was no longer mine alone, it had been invaded by an unseen presence. At first, I tried rationalizing it, clinging to the hope that I was simply imagining things. Old building, thin walls, a dog that barked at every sound, perhaps I was just being overly sensitive. But it became harder and harder to ignore the little things, the subtle intrusions that chipped away at my peace of mind. Footsteps outside my door when no one was there, reflections in windows where movement didn't belong, the persistent sensation that someone was always just on the edge of my vision, watching me. Eli's intrusions became more deliberate, more blatant, leaving no room for doubt. I returned from work one evening to find him standing at the far end of the hallway, pretending to look at his mailbox, but watching my apartment with a gaze that followed me the whole way inside, a predatory stare that made my skin crawl. My stomach twisted with a knot of fear. "Hey, Eli," I said casually, trying to mask my unease, forcing a smile. He nodded, smiled faintly, then continued as if nothing had happened, his demeanor perfectly normal, yet his presence sending shivers down my spine. Later, strange odors began emanating from his apartment, further fueling my anxieties. Chemical tangs, burnt smells that made me nauseous, permeated the air, seeping into my own apartment. My mind wandered to dark possibilities, conjuring up images of illicit activities. But I told myself I couldn't jump to conclusions, that I had to remain rational. It could be anything, I reasoned. Maybe he cooked something unusual, or perhaps it was a cleaning mishap. Then the noises started at night, escalating my fear to a fever pitch. Whispers, scraping sounds along the walls, a soft thud outside my bedroom door, sounds that seemed calculated to unnerve me. Bailey would growl, his hackles raised, ears pricked, refusing to settle even when I tried to comfort him, his canine instinct sensing a clear and present danger. Sleep became sporadic, a luxury I could no longer afford. I left lights on, double-checked locks, and kept my phone close, my hand hovering over the emergency dial. The paranoia gnawed at me, but something primal in my gut insisted that Eli's presence was more than coincidental, that he was deliberately targeting me. One evening, around 11:15 p.m., I returned from a late client meeting, my hands full of papers and my laptop bag weighing heavily on my shoulder. I noticed movement at the far end of the courtyard, a figure lurking in the shadows. Eli had emerged from behind a snowbank, standing too casually near the edge of the alley, his presence sending a shiver down my spine. "Nice night, isn't it?" he called, his voice oddly calm, his tone unsettlingly casual. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The casual greeting masked something chilling, a hidden intent that I couldn't decipher. He wasn't just being polite, he was observing me, assessing my vulnerability. He wanted to be noticed, to make his presence known. I nodded briefly and walked faster, my pace quickening, but the tight knot in my chest didn't loosen. The fear remained, a constant companion. That night, I couldn't sleep, my mind consumed by anxieties. Shadows from tree branches outside moved across the room like ghostly fingers, their movements mocking me. Bailey paced restlessly, whining softly, never settling, his unease mirroring my own. I realized then that my sense of safety had been violated, not physically, but mentally, an invasion of my inner peace. I was living under constant surveillance, a prisoner in my own home, and it was wearing me down, eroding my sanity. The first truly terrifying incident happened weeks later, solidifying my fears and pushing me to the brink. I was taking out the trash, a mundane task that suddenly felt fraught with danger. The alley behind the building was silent except for the crunch of snow under my boots, the crisp air biting at my skin. At the end of the alley, standing under a flickering streetlight, was Eli, his figure illuminated by the harsh glare. He hadn't been there 5 minutes before. I'd checked the bins, the path, the empty street, ensuring my safety. His gaze met mine directly, his eyes piercing through me. I froze, paralyzed by fear. He raised a finger slowly to his lips, silencing me, smiling faintly, a sinister expression that sent a shiver down my spine. My first instinct was to run, and I did, heart hammering, breath freezing in the cold night. Back inside, I locked the door, called 911, and stayed on the phone until the officers arrived, my voice trembling as I recounted the terrifying encounter. By the time they got there, Eli had vanished, disappearing into the shadows. Surveillance footage later confirmed what I suspected. He had been lurking outside my apartment multiple times, sometimes peering through windows, sometimes just waiting silently, his presence a constant threat. I installed extra locks, blackout curtains, motion sensor lights, transforming my apartment into a fortress. I never walked alone at night, avoiding any unnecessary risks. I became hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every potential danger. The scrape of shoes in the hallway, the whisper of the wind, the creak of the stairwell, each sound sending my heart racing. Objects occasionally seemed moved, though I could never be sure, fueling my paranoia. Every day became a psychological struggle to maintain calm, to convince myself I wasn't losing control of my mind, that I wasn't simply imagining things. Weeks turned into months, blurring together in a haze of fear and anxiety. Sleep became a luxury, a distant memory. Every knock, every creak of the building, every shadow was a potential threat, triggering a wave of panic. Even when I tried to focus on work, my mind wandered to him, to Eli, always watching, always present, just beyond my perception, a constant reminder of my vulnerability. Friends suggested stronger action, more police reports, restraining orders, mediation, a desperate attempt to regain control. But without tangible harm, without any physical violence, there was little that could be done. Building management pushed for a polite resolution, a peaceful solution that ignored the underlying threat. But Eli's polite demeanor was a mask, a facade that concealed his true intentions. The tension escalated to the point where every simple action, checking the mail, walking to the lobby, doing laundry, felt like navigating a minefield, fraught with unseen dangers. My life shrank within the walls of my apartment, confined by fear. Yet even there, he intruded, through sight, sound, and imagination, a constant presence that I couldn't escape. Eventually, I found a new apartment in South Portland and moved quickly, leaving behind the space I had once loved, desperate to escape the torment. Physically, I was safe, but the psychological imprint remained, a permanent scar on my psyche. Months later, I still jump at footsteps, my nerves still raw. Bailey still growls at empty corridors, his canine senses on high alert. And I can't shake the sensation of being watched in new spaces, the lingering fear that I am never truly alone. The lesson is clear: safety is fragile, easily shattered. Threats are not always obvious, and danger doesn't always need to be physical to be real. Someone can invade your life through observation, presence, and subtle manipulation, wearing down your sense of security until every shadow feels like a threat. Trust your instincts, set boundaries, and recognize that even polite facades can conceal obsession, a dark undercurrent of malicious intent. Awareness and vigilance can't eliminate fear, but they can keep you from being powerless in the face of it, allowing you to protect yourself from unseen dangers. Music. When Claire and I moved into 128, Willow Lane in Hawthorne Oaks, I honestly thought it was the start of a perfect chapter in our lives, the beginning of our happily ever after. Columbus, Ohio in the summer had that sticky humidity that clung to your skin, making you feel perpetually damp, but the streets of our neighborhood were quiet, lined with mature oak trees that stretched their branches across the roads like protective arms, creating a canopy of green. Claire was managing her small online boutique, working from home, surrounded by her creations, while I logged hours as a software engineer, immersed in lines of code. Our daughter Leia, barely 3, was a whirlwind of energy, laughing, exploring, and learning to run faster than I could catch her, filling our home with joy. Life felt stable, predictable, and for the first time in years, I truly felt like home had a heartbeat, a warm, comforting rhythm. Then it started, the subtle intrusions that shattered our peace and plunged us into a world of fear. The first instance seemed trivial at first, easily dismissed as a coincidence. It was a Thursday night, humid enough that the windows were slightly fogged, obscuring the view. Claire was putting Leia to bed, reading her a bedtime story, when faint knocking came from the front door, a soft, hesitant sound. "Must be the neighbor," she whispered to herself, assuming it was nothing to worry about. I was in the home office, my laptop screen reflecting lines of code, oblivious to the sounds outside. I barely looked up, assuming it was nothing important, a routine occurrence. But she mentioned it again later, worry threading through her voice, her unease palpable, and I got up to check, my curiosity piqued. Nothing. No packages, no one on the porch, just the shadows of the oak trees stretching into the night, their branches swaying in the breeze. That night, sleep felt heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath, anticipating some unseen threat. Even with the windows closed, every creak sounded amplified, magnified by my heightened senses. Every rustle outside became an imagined threat, fueling my anxieties. I chalked it up to nerves, to new homeowner jitters, but a subtle chill settled in, a cold premonition that I couldn't shake. The next evening, the knocking returned, this time at the back door, a more insistent sound that jolted us from our peace. Claire woke me, whispering urgently, her voice filled with fear. "Marcus, I swear someone's out there." I grabbed a flashlight, cautiously stepping onto the porch, heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The yard was empty, dark, and still, except for the sway of the trees, their shadows dancing in the darkness. I tried to laugh it off, to reassure her and myself. "It's probably just a raccoon," I said, forcing a smile. But the instinct in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise, a primal warning that something was wrong. Over the following week, things escalated subtly, the intrusions becoming more frequent and more unsettling. Doors rattled at odd times, as if someone was testing the locks, trying to gain entry. Windows tapped as if someone was leaning against them, their presence a tangible weight. Occasionally, heavy footsteps echoed across the backyard, pacing with intent, as if someone was watching us, stalking us from the shadows. Motion sensor lights and a small camera didn't help, offering a false sense of security. The footage was either empty, showing nothing but the swaying trees, or blurred, showing distorted images that were more unsettling than reassuring. Shadows moving in ways that didn't make sense, defying logic and reason. Claire started sleeping lightly, her rest disturbed by nightmares. Leia started waking up at every unfamiliar sound, crying for reasons that made little sense, her innocent spirit sensing the unease that permeated our home. Something, or someone, was watching us, and the presence grew heavier every night, suffocating us with fear. By the end of that week, I realized this was no random prank, no harmless game. Someone had chosen us, singled us out, and our sense of security, the one thing we took for granted, was slipping through our fingers, vanishing like smoke. It happened late one night, around 12:30 a.m., the kind of still hour when every house feels suspended in time, caught between dreams and reality. Claire woke me suddenly, panic in her voice, her eyes wide with terror. "Marcus, there's someone at the bedroom window." I rolled over, trying to calm my racing heart, to reassure her that it was nothing. "It's probably just a branch, Claire," I said, my voice thick with sleep. But when I followed her gaze, my own blood ran cold, a wave of fear washing over me. A figure stood outside, cloaked in black, a hood obscuring his face, rendering him anonymous, devoid of humanity. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, silent, deliberate, threatening in his stillness, a dark sentinel watching over us. "Call 911, Claire hissed, her voice barely audible above the pounding of my heart. I froze, torn between grabbing the phone and confronting the stranger, my mind racing with possibilities. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and the figure lunged, shoving me back before vanishing into the darkness, his movements swift and silent. Minutes later, police arrived, combing the yard, checking the surrounding streets, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. No one was found, just a lingering dread, a whisper of presence that refused to leave, haunting our home. That night, I lay awake beside Claire, Leia asleep between us, her small body a source of comfort. I realized then that physical harm wasn't necessary for terror, that the most effective weapon was fear itself. The mere act of intrusion, the unseen vigilance, had invaded our lives, poisoning our peace of mind. We had been chosen, observed, and hunted in the most subtle way possible, targeted by an unseen predator. The next weeks were a blur of precaution and paranoia, a constant state of high alert. Locks were reinforced with deadbolts, curtains drawn permanently, sealing us off from the outside world. I installed a professional security system with night vision cameras, transforming our home into a fortress. Every motion detected became a trigger for anxiety, sending my heart racing. Even daylight couldn't erase the feeling of being observed, the persistent sense that we were being watched. I noticed fleeting shadows when mowing the lawn, a black shape disappearing behind neighboring houses, figures in the periphery that melted away when looked at directly, fueling my paranoia. Claire grew restless, unable to sleep, her nerves frayed. Leia started waking up, screaming, crying for reasons that made little sense, her innocent spirit disturbed by the darkness that had enveloped our home. Every routine, going for a walk, taking out the trash, even opening the garage, became an ordeal, a terrifying test of courage. The neighborhood, once peaceful, now felt like a stage for an unseen predator, a hunting ground for a malevolent force. Friends suggested we file more reports, involve the police further, or even move, urging us to take action. But life's responsibilities and Leia's schooling made a hasty exit complicated, trapping us in our fear. Each evening was a test of endurance, a battle against the encroaching darkness. I'd stand at the window, scanning the darkness, flashlight and phone in hand, trying to anticipate any movement, any sign of the night stalker. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind through the leaves, every car passing on the street became a potential threat, sending my heart racing. We were prisoners in our own home, bound by the invisible thread of fear, the web the night stalker had woven around us. Weeks turned into relentless psychological warfare, a constant assault on our sanity. I noticed Claire flinching at shadows during the day, her eyes darting nervously. Leia sometimes pointed at corners and whimpered, her innocent gaze seeing things we couldn't. Even my work was interrupted by moments of hypervigilance, scanning emails, code, and messages while mentally checking doors and windows, ensuring our safety. The most chilling part was the uncertainty, the lack of knowledge about our tormentor. We never saw him clearly, never heard him speak, never understood his intent, the mystery fueling our fear. The unknown was worse than a known threat, forcing constant vigilance, making even the most mundane tasks, a trip to the mailbox, a walk around the block, feel impossible without fear. Our conversations became tense, fraught with anxiety. Claire would whisper, "Did you see anything?" And I'd shake my head, though my stomach twisted with unease, haunted by the unseen presence. The paranoia seeped into everything, poisoning our relationships, our work, our sleep. This presence, though fleeting and unseen, dictated our lives, controlling our actions. Eventually, we made our decision to relocate to a gated community, several miles removed from the lingering dread of Hawthorne Oaks, was swift and unanimous. The night stalker never physically reappeared, never directly engaged us again. Yet, the invisible wounds he inflicted festered. Claire remained perpetually on edge, startled by the mundane creaks and groans of the house. Leia recoiled from elongated shadows stretching across the lawn, each one a phantom reminder of the violation we endured. As for myself, a compulsive ritual consumed me, the relentless checking of locks, the obsessive scrutiny of windows, the constant monitoring of security cameras, even under the bright, reassuring gaze of the midday sun in our new, ostensibly safer haven. The haunting truth we extracted from our ordeal was disarmingly simple: yet profound in its implications. Danger does not always herald its arrival with a cacophony of violence, with shattered glass and forced entries. Sometimes, terror whispers, insinuates itself, remains frustratingly intangible, yet possesses a chilling reality all its own. Trust your instincts, that primal, guttural warning that bubbles up from the depths of your being. Protect your boundaries, both physical and emotional, for they are the ramparts against unseen invaders. Understand that fear, that insidious parasite, can be implanted without so much as a scratch upon the skin, leaving behind scars that, though invisible to the naked eye, are nonetheless enduring, festering wounds upon the soul. The Night Stalker may not have plundered our material possessions, nor inflicted physical harm upon our bodies. But he robbed us of something far more precious, something irreplaceable, our peace of mind. He imparted a brutal lesson, etched into the very fabric of our being, a lesson I suspect will haunt us for the remainder of our days. Safety, we learned, is a fragile illusion, a gossamer web easily torn asunder. Vigilance, therefore, is not merely advisable, but an absolute necessity, a constant state of readiness. Even when the tangible threat recedes into the shadows, its spectral presence lingers, an unwelcome guest subtly influencing every decision, coloring every perception, shaping every corner of your life.